it's a shame that it came to that. It's a terrible, terrible tragedy. And I'm disappointed because I believe, absent some of that countervailing aggressive tactical action, I believe we could have got a lot more people out, perhaps everyone.
My guest today on the Historically Present podcast is Gary Noesner, who led the negotiations during the Waco Siege, which happened in 1993, a huge part of American history. The story took off on February 28th, 1993, when an ATF raid went horribly wrong on a compound with a religious group inside called the Branch Davidians, led by David Koresh. It led to a gun battle over 2 hours in length, a shootout leaving four ATF agents dead and six Branch Davidians lost their lives as well. What ensued then was a 51-day standoff when the FBI hostage rescue team came in hoping to defuse the situation. They did save some lives. But by April 19th of 93, the tactical team had come in with tanks hoping to finally put an end to this situation. But instead, the compound fell to ruin in one giant fire, leaving about 80 Branch Davidians, including many women and children, dead. Just 9 inside the compound would ultimately survive the blaze. Noesner joining me for a deep conversation about what he did, the role he played in saving lives, the regrets, the lessons learned he feels the FBI has taken with them after the ordeal in 93, the negotiation tactics, describing those as well as Noesner and his conversations over the phone with David Koresh, plus the Hollywood portrayals of this Waco situation, some of which Noesner was intimately involved in. We'll hear about his role in those as well. I'm Bryan Fenley. Thanks so much for watching. Humbled and grateful to have Gary Noesner on with me. He is a retired chief of the FBI's crisis unit, and he played a big part in the Waco situation, which we will talk about. Also get into his book, Stalling for Time, My Life as an FBI Hostage Negotiator, up for purchase, Amazon.com. I'm Bryan Fenley. This is the Historically Present podcast, where we look at how past events shape today's life. And Gary, it's great to have you. Do I understand now that the book is paperback as well too, so a lot of ways to consume?
Yeah, first of all, it's good to be with you here. And it came out in hardback in 2010, and when the Waco series came out, which I was involved in, they Random House decided to move to a paperback edition, and I also recorded the audiobook for those who like to listen to audiobooks.
What was it like for you to record your voice over what you wrote?
It's more difficult than one would imagine. You say I'm reading the words I wrote, but how we write and the pace with which we speak and when you put in breaks and pauses. I had a really super duper engineer get me through the process, and I kept saying, "You're the one that ought to be reading this thing." I mean, he was really, really good. He was an NPR host in his, when he wasn't doing this sort of thing. And the guy was just amazing. But yeah, I mean, it took 3 days, I think, 3 full days of recording. And yeah, it's tougher than it seems.
Were there certain parts where you're like, I want to make sure that I say it this way? Understandably, a couple of takes, and you're like, okay, now I feel like I've really captured the moment in a piece of the writing that you're telling and you're speaking through the audio.
Well, not so much as it translated to audio. I mean, I obviously any if you've written a book or anybody's been involved in that, you spend a lot of time, devote a lot of energy into getting the chapter you want. It's kind of funny, Brian. When Random House, signed me to give me advance to write the book, which was very nice. They wanted like 85,000 words. I gave them 185,000 words. Um, there were so many stories that didn't even make it in the book. For example, they said, well, how many prison riots are you going to write about? Or how many sieges of this or that? And, you know, um, it sounds egotistical to say this, but when I wrote the book, I looked back and I remember the first thing I told my wife, I said, I don't think people are going to believe that one person was involved in
Yeah.
so many things. And, and I never looked at it in its totality, until I put it all together and went through all the things I worked. I get, pretty damn interesting career. And yeah, I'm very proud of my career and contributions that I made. I was always proud to work for the FBI, but yeah, it's a lot of water over the dam.
Where did you do most of your writing for this?
Well, I had been retired for 5 years from the FBI after a 30-year career, and I went to work for Control Risk, a British international risk consultancy, mostly helping clients deal with kidnappings abroad of their employees. And I only planned to do that for about 5 years. And when I hit the 5-year mark, I decided to go ahead and write a book because everybody had been kind of urging me to do so for a long time. And I have a Peter Bergen who's written some books about Osama bin Laden and used to be on CNN. It was a casual friend, and I took him to lunch, and he put me in touch with his literary agent, and the rest is history. That was an incredible gift he gave me in putting me in contact with her.
Not only did you get your stories out through being an author and writing this book, but also you were heavily involved in the making of some documentary series, multi-part series with Paramount Plus, which is called Waco. I encourage everybody to check that out. That obviously took parts of your book and you were there as a consultant. How, I don't know if the word is right, cathartic or to relive it in a way like that where it's re-dramatized. How did you observe that internally and what that felt like for you?
I have to admit, I did not find it traumatizing, but I did find it simply amazing to be on a essentially a movie set and watch how that all happens. And I was fortunate with the Paramount series. The fantastic actor, twice Academy Award nominated Michael Shannon played me, and we become good friends. I just texted him yesterday, and he's just incredible to watch. And but I have to say, the first time they were filming a scene and somebody walks up to him in the scene they're filming and says, "Are you Gary Noesner?" or something like that. And I said, "No, he's not. I'm Gary Noesner. What are they doing?" and But it's a very interesting process, and you also realize that there's a lot that gets done for dramatic effect that departs from a strictly accurate sense of what happened. For example, in the series, they're depicting me negotiating essentially by myself with one other negotiator. During Waco, we had 8 negotiators per shift. I mean, it's quite a complex operation. And so a lot of the things they had my character doing, most of them were reflective of what happened, but not necessarily for me. There's other negotiators talking to Koresh at the time and having the conversation that was basically depicted.
How much time did you spend with Michael Shannon to really teach him
Well,
what
I
you
was
like?
out there I mean, I didn't have to teach him much. He's such a quick study, and he read my book and watched other documentaries, and he kind of blew me away with how, I mean, he wasn't trying to mimic me or like Taylor Kitsch was pretty much trying to show the David Koresh that we all knew, and he was amazing. But Mike wasn't trying to, do a parody, not a parody, but a parallel depiction of me. But in his own way, the way he presented the arguments that were in the script, the positions I took were quite accurate. And but we had during the months that I was there, we had he and I had drinks and dinner every night, along with some of the other cast. It was quite a nice experience and immensely talented people, just immensely talented.
What were those conversations like? You go a day of shooting, and now you get a little bit of time to kick back before the next day of filming. And are you rehashing the day? Yeah, what is a
Well,
conversation like
typically,
there?
there would be some initial conversation about, the impressions of the day and did I like this or not? And, I was always pretty candid with him. And the director, John Dowdle, let me interact with Mike a little bit and say, I wouldn't do that. I'll give you a really interesting example. I'm watching the filming once of Mike playing me meeting the sheriff in a local bar during the Waco siege. And, I hadn't seen Mike that morning, and I'm in my chair with all the other folks there, and I'm watching the scene. They do the clapboard. He comes in, and he's got an FBI raid jacket on, and he's walking into a Texas bar. And I just start to And I called the director aside. I said, number one, I've never worn one of those in my life. And I said I would never wear one into a bar in Texas where half the people have guns and the other half have been arrested or some combination.
Yes.
So they changed it. So he took it off and well, and he said, well, how will they know? He hasn't met the sheriff before. How will they know? I said, two cops will know who each other are. If one's in a bar waiting for the other, they know. And so there was a lot of little changes like that I was able to insert. But when you sell your book rights, you have input, but you don't have control. There's clearly some things I would have liked to seen, more substantially different. And I mentioned to you before our call, I think the depiction of David Koresh was far too sympathetic. I don't think the directors were necessarily trying to present it that way, but that's how it came out, in my opinion, and so many who have spoken to me. But I stand by the depiction of the FBI side of it, which I think showed both the good things that we did, and it showed organizationally a lot of the bad decisions that FBI leadership made that contributed, in my opinion, to the outcome.
How much is there an unspoken language between FBI negotiators? You just mentioned how like police can be or cops can be in a bar and one could know that the other one's one without maybe even saying anything. What is that unspoken language like between FBI negotiators?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, I think a certain type of personality is drawn. It's a voluntary, nobody forces anyone to become a negotiator. So people seek out the opportunity to get this training. So they tend to be really successful agents who are good interviewers, interrogators. They're good at developing informants, which is an important thing for the FBI if we're trying to infiltrate organized crime or recruit a spy from a foreign country. So those kinds of people seem to be attracted to the profession. So we approach life's problems in a very similar, thoughtful way, where years ago we did a psychological study of of the best negotiators in the FBI to determine what are the common characteristics so we could use it for selection. And the biggest uh, commonality we came up with was a rule breaker, someone who breaks the rules to get things done. Not in a sinister way, but yeah. And I thought that was a very interesting outcome, but not really addressing your question, I suppose. But the guys on the tactical side, our partners in most of these sieges, they tend to be more kinetic and more focused on the mission they have to do and the movement as a team. And it's quite a different approach. Some people are quite successful at both, but typically there's a different personality that's attracted to these specialties.
In the case of David and you talking to him, how much did and you liken your experiences to being a rule breaker in the sense of progress and things happening that way, but being a pseudo therapist in that situation and listening to him as if you're like a mental health therapist in a way.
Well, I got there the first night. The ceasefire had already been established, and Koresh was wounded. He was in great discomfort, but the thing had been relatively stabilized. And immediately I knew that um, even though it was a hard sell, I had to convince him that the FBI was now a different entity that was coming in to resolve this, that we weren't simply an extension of ATF, for whom he was very angry. And so in my early conversations with him, I think this is a guy we can work with. I mean, the fact that we had obtained a ceasefire and there was no additional shots for several hours is a positive sign. And he had already, even before I got there, let a few kids go. So I, I looked at this as allowing the emotional levels to subside some more based on the reaction to the terrible shootout with ATF. And then once those emotions are reduced, then he would be in a position to make better rational decisions. We use my favorite teaching tool. We use the childhood teeter totter in the playground. And what I always say is when emotions are high, rational thinking is very low. And our job as negotiators is to lower emotions. And when we do, rational thinking comes up. And I think it's really the key guide to crisis negotiations and appreciating the fact that no one's going to come out because your brilliant argument or the title that you carry when you arrive. They're going to come out because you've established a level of trust and sincerity and genuineness, and you come across as somebody who's there to help them and not make their day worse. And that's what I tried to do with David, and that's generally speaking what we as negotiators tried to do throughout the process.
How did he communicate to you how he appreciated the way in which you handled things by you making him feel heard?
I don't know that he verbalized that, not to me at least. I don't think he said, "Well, thank you for hearing my side out." I don't recall any conversations like that. But instead, when they continue to talk and the conversations become longer and more detailed and maybe drift away from the crisis at hand, you as a negotiator get the sense that you're making that connection or certainly advancing that cause in your efforts. I mean, it can take quite a while. With David Koresh, you're talking about a guy that had complete and utter control over all of his followers. He was a god in there. And now you're telling him, hey, you're a low-life criminal. You got to go to jail, and we, of course, never said that to him like that. But those are difficult things to overcome, and particularly with the loss of life that it. I mean, when I got there, there's four dead ATF agents, 17 wounded. I think four, five, six, maybe Davidians killed. We didn't even know the exact number at first, and you know, now I'm supposed to come in with my team and say, hey, let's be nice. And you can't imagine a more difficult way to start a negotiation. So we had to get through a lot of the emotional response to events before we could get into anything substantive.
How many hours on the phone do you think overall you were talking to David?
I don't have those. For me, it wasn't that long. My job is to run the whole team. I mean, at that point in my career, I'd already, you know, normally I wouldn't even get on the phone in a situation. I'm managing the whole team and developing the strategy and telling the boss, what I think we should do. But no other negotiators were really there yet from the FBI because I flew out early. So I ended up speaking with him that first night. But it's not a complex process. You just literally you have to listen to the other person and give them an opportunity to articulate their perspective. That doesn't mean you agree with it. You think they're right or wrong. That's immaterial. You're just saying, can you tell me more about that? Well, what happened and how do you feel about that? And what impact did that have? And how's everybody doing in there? More normal kinds of conversations that a lot of times in stressful situations, people don't expect that from law enforcement. They expect this is Officer Noesner. You'll come out now, please, or we're going to have to come in and get you. And instead, it's, hey, Bryan, this is Gary. I want to help you get out of this mess. And you can see the very dramatic difference in tone and approach that we have found, more often than not leads to success.
How much of a badge of pride do you take in how many you got out of there?
I do. It's kind of funny, Bryan. I tell people, they may find this hard to believe, that I'm more proud of Waco than anything I've ever done. And it's also the thing that gives me the most angst and problem because it's a mixed bag. The negotiation team, we set up a process out there and a way of managing information and that the FBI still uses today that was invented on the fly at Waco, writing position papers and the way we did our analysis and had discussions after each conversation. That stuff was all very now it been incorporated for years in the FBI's training of local police around the world. So there was a lot of really great innovative things we did. And we're flexible. You typically don't send something in unless you get something out. And we send in some milk. We got a kid out, or we send in Koresh wanted to see pictures of himself on Time and Newsweek and, typical ego guy. We sent that stuff in and we did things that you typically probably wouldn't see a negotiation team doing. Um, you know, the biggest one, of course, was on I think the third day when he wanted us to give him a national broadcast. And we said, hey, David, of course, we're thinking Jonestown, this is guy's going to get a live camera and he's going to kill
Yeah.
himself or whatever. So, I said, I don't think I can sell that, but if you make a recording, we'll listen to it. And if it's not suicidal, I think we even said that word to him. Well, we're not going to kill ourselves. Okay, I hear you, but we'd like to hear what you're going to say. And if we don't have a problem with it, I'll see if my boss will allow it to be broadcast. And at 58 minutes, I think we listened to it, didn't see any problems. It was a lot of gobbledygook, frankly, but we took it to Baylor University and had the religious scholars listen to it. There's something in here we're not picking up on. People criticize us for not engaging with religious scholars, but we did. It's just not necessarily them. Everybody thinks they're the expert that should be spoken with. Um, and we didn't find any problem with. So I went to the boss and I said, I don't know if he'll follow through, but he says they'll all come out. And we had him put that in the recording. I've told the FBI that after this is played nationally, I and my followers will come out peacefully.
Wow.
So I can, and the boss was initially resistant, Jeff Jamar. He basically, well, what are we getting for it? And I said, I think you're asking the wrong question. And he said, what? I said, the question is, what do we lose? I said, we don't lose anything. If the public hears this broadcast, believe me, it's not going to win him sympathetic support. People are going to say this guy's really a nut job. But we may end up resolving the whole situation. I can't guarantee it, but it's worth a try. And of course, we played it, and Koresh reneged, and God spoke to him, told him change his mind. Well, that disappointed me and the negotiation team. But we're used to people lying to us. We're used to people saying they'll do one thing and doing something else. But we have strategies for coming back to that. We would have come back and said, David, I did everything you wanted. I went to my boss. I went out on a limb. I convinced him against his better judgment to do this because you promised me. You made a solemn commitment to me. And we would have hammered that. Now, would that have led to his reconsideration? I mean, I don't know, but that's the approach. And instead, as I think everyone knows, is the on-scene commander became livid, the tactical commander even more so, and they went forward with tanks and did some destructive maneuvers outside. Now Koresh goes ballistic. You said you would stay off our property, and on both sides you get this unnecessary escalation that damages relationship building and took us quite a long time to get back on course.
Patience seems to be, and this wasn't you, but the tactical unit, if I'm not mistaken, you get to 50, 51 days, and it's like, how much longer is this going to go? How, if you were there at the end, how much patience were you willing to have to just see
Well,
how long this
I
goes?
left halfway, as you know, but I think um, near the end, I forget what particular day, but the FBI, I was gone already. They actually let Dick DeGuerin, who I think you've
Yep.
interviewed, uh, and his associate go in, and they came out and said, Koresh says he'll surrender as soon as he writes the seven seals. Now that sort of froze the federal government from doing anything else, giving him a decent amount of time to put those together. But time went by, nothing was produced. The Davidians will tell you, oh, he was working on it. He was working on it. But I remember the FBI negotiators asked Steve Snyder, his number one assistant, how far is David? He said, well, he hasn't even started yet. And the FBI, and I don't think wrongly, uh, decision makers came to the realization that this might be just a big stalling tactic. So law enforcement doesn't have a lot between negotiations and assault. There's not a lot of options. And so they decided, well, who in their right mind would stay inside of a house, a building that's filled with tear gas, and mothers will take children out? And I think that group think became a little too certain about what response would happen to that gas. And so they put in the tear gas. It was a windy day. They probably shouldn't have gone that day. And then the fire was started by the Davidians. There's arson investigations proving that. Um, Testimony of Graham Craddock, a survivor. All of that's well documented for those who want to listen and learn. There's many who don't. But you know, it's a shame that it came to that. It's a terrible, terrible tragedy, and I'm disappointed because I believe, absent some of that countervailing aggressive tactical action, I believe we could have got a lot more people out, perhaps everyone. Um, it's the problem we had, and people say a lot of different things, but we had a fundamental philosophical difference of opinion with the hostage rescue team leader. He felt the best way to get them out was to tighten the pressure, increase the threat, and force or compel them out. As negotiators, we call that the paradox of power. The harder you push, the more likely it is you get resistance. So we knew that was the wrong way to go. And unfortunately, the on-scene commander sided more with the tactical commander than he did with me. Now, to give him credit, I would go in and brief him. He said, "Yep, that's good, Gary. Go ahead with that." And then the tactical commander would come in and say something countervailing. He said, "Yep, that's good. Let's go with that." Never appreciating, I think, the extent of which we sent mixed signals that really thwarted our ability to be as effective as negotiators as we could.
The nine survivors on April 19th, 1993, I know you've gotten to know some of them, like David Thibodeau. What commonalities do you see, or have you read, or have you seen, and have you talked to them about that they all share to where they had something within them to break away from the groupthink of let's stay here?
I don't think that's the way to look at it. 8 of the 9 survivors had accelerant on their clothing.
Wow.
They had, in other words, diesel fuel, gas fuel, not just on their pants, on their shirt sleeves and stuff. Now, one would speculate, and Thibodeau is not one of those. I think he's the one that did not. But one could speculate that by and large, those were people who were positioned to start the fires and did so, and therefore were closer to the external sides of the building where they could effect an exit.
But they
Now, I
felt
wasn't there. I wasn't part of the arson investigation, but I think that's, I mean, that seems the most logical to me.
it it also
I think that blew you away, didn't it?
I'm like that is something, Gary, I am blown away because I think there you'll hear like a lot of the survivors talk and they'll mention how even though they left, they still would have this strong allegiance to
Oh,
David
yeah.
Koresh, but they weren't willing to go as far as give it all and give their life up to it. How many, again, this is speculation, so maybe this isn't the right question, but I guess I'm just throwing this out there for the reasons of talking about it. How many others felt like they should have done that, but for one reason or not, were convinced not to, were told not to, were afraid to where they did end up giving their life up for this?
Well, there's a lot of group think, but you also have to remember that these followers, and I don't question their absolute
Yeah.
fealty and devotion to David Koresh and what he was teaching them. And, it's not like he was holding them prisoner. I mean, they were attracted and stayed and lived with him and accepted that way of life because, there was something that it provided them, whether, psychological need, whatever. So I think, in many respects, people go along, they wait to be led. And, we got 35 people out the first half while I was there. No one came out after, by the way. 21 of those were children. So the other 14 were adults. And that was very difficult to convince the adults to do what you're referring to, leave behind the home, the faith that they had adopted, embraced, and come out and subject themselves to the authorities. It was not an easy task to convince some to do so. And we really tried to tug at the heartstrings of the mothers. So these kids would come out and, they would have a note that would say, I'm to be sent to my aunt. I'm just making this up, Aunt Sophie in Des Moines or whatever it might be. And our view was, no, we're going to keep the kids here in a comfortable child protective service home, well cared for by a staff of people. And then we're going to really hammer this with the mothers repeatedly. Hey, your job is to come out We're not sending your kids away to live with Aunt Sophie. We're waiting for you, mom, to come out and give your child the love and support that they need. And I think we had some success with that. And I think we would have had more. About the near the end of my tenure there, we got 7 adults out in one day. 7. And I mean, the negotiators were opening champagne. I had always had a theory called trickle flow gush, and that's we slowly draw a few out, and then we get more and more and more, and then they all start coming out and realizing that was the thing to do. But immediately after that 7th person came out, I mean, the tanks rolled forward for absolutely no reason and engaged in very aggressive activity, and we were cooked. Koresh said, "That's it. No one else is coming out," and no one did, other than the people that survived the fire on the final day. It's just terrible, and it's counter to everything the FBI had always taught and has re-embraced since. After Waco, the on-scene commander and the tactical commander were encouraged to retire, and they did. I was given a promotion because although the FBI defended itself from public criticism, not surprisingly, nonetheless, internally, we realized we had screwed up. We did not follow our own protocols for which we were world famous. Every department in the country follows FBI's crisis management guidelines, and then we violate them in the most public event we've ever had. It was quite troubling. For example, at one point in time, one of the on-scene commanders, there's 4 of them at a situation, played those audio tapes of these boots are made for walking and all that. And many times I had people say, "Well, what kind of negotiation tactic is that?" I said, "Well, it's not. It never has been." The FBI had always taught before, during, and after that those agitation deprivation techniques don't work. We don't believe in them, but yet they were done out there without the knowledge of the negotiation team. So that's the kind of disconnect that we had to deal with. Now, when you sum all this out, who's the bad guy? Who's responsible? Well, I think it's David Koresh. I mean, we gave him a chance to lead his followers out every single day. We made tons of accommodations, but that then does not mean that the FBI didn't make decisions. FBI agents are some incredible people. And I think it's very, very difficult for someone who's dedicated their lives to service in the FBI to come to grips with the fact that maybe something we did as an organization caused so many lives to be lost. So the default position is, well, it was going to end this way anyway. Nothing we could have done would have changed it, which I think is a really disservice to the negotiators and what we accomplished. No, it wasn't destined to end this way. Would Koresh have decided ultimately to stay in and commit suicide? I don't know, but I always felt he would end up, once he saw the drain of his people, he would end up deciding he needed to lead them out. But that's my opinion. It can't be proven one way or another.
How would, when you were negotiating, if there was social media, how would that have helped you in the process of bringing more people out and diffusing the situation, or could it be agitating? And we'll never know, but just the role of social media and if that was present during this event.
No, it really wasn't. I don't think anybody's ever asked me that question, but well, I'll give you a story. We try to, and people criticize, oh, the FBI was controlling everything. Well, yeah, when we're dealing with a crisis, that's exactly what we want the people we're dealing with to have only one conduit for conversation. That's us. For example, early, the first couple hours before I got there, one of the sheriff's department negotiators was on the phone with Koresh, and an operator breaks in on the phone line and says, "This is the operator. I have a call from a current affair for Mr. David Koresh. Would you like to take the call?" And the negotiator says, "Operator, this is law enforcement. We have a crisis situation. Do not break." She breaks the call off and hooks David Koresh up with a current affair. Now, what training does this reporter have? Are they going to say, "Oh, you're going to kill anybody?" Or, what are your demands? Or all sorts of things that we wouldn't want them to be involved in, and we're not participating in. So it's a roundabout way of answering your question about social media, but it throws a wild card into things. And I guess it depends on what's on the social media and how much access do the people have to it. Does it influence their behavior? I could envision circumstances where it might be a positive factor, but I see more problems with it than anything else. And but that's the reality negotiators face now. People, there's been negotiations over, over FaceTime and all sorts of things that I didn't have to contend with when I retired.
There's a lot of, I'm wondering, Gary, how social media would have been able to have answers for some of the lingering conspiracy theories, if you want to call that. Some people do, some people don't, in and unanswered questions that some people feel like haven't been answered. And if you see it like that, as if that could have led us to more answers, or at least sort of quiet the crowd on one side that's like screaming about certain things that they thought happened and maybe aren't acknowledged by others.
I don't know. I think social media is such a conduit for people to um, make thoughtful comments, but also wildly speculative comments, and it's hard to control. What really set us up in a bad way for Waco was 6 months before there was Ruby Ridge. I was out of the country for Ruby Ridge, and I wasn't out there for that. But the same tactical commander is the one that, in my opinion and others, gave illegal orders. Shoot anyone you see outside the cabin. And an FBI marksman shot at Randy Weaver and ended up accidentally killing Mrs. Weaver as she's holding a baby. Well, that certainly stirred up a lot of anti-government sentiment, mostly at that time out in that part of the country, in the Idaho in the Northwest. Then Waco comes across 6 months later, and the same HRT commander is there. He probably should have been relieved after Ruby Ridge, but he wasn't. And he's got the same very aggressive, we know how to do this. In my book, I talk about the Talladega prison riots that happened prior to that. And it was a 8-day siege, and Cuban inmates were holding correctional officers and Bureau of Prisons, immigration people, and we negotiated. And it was an extremely challenging situation. And we got one hostage out, and she said they're drawing names. They're going to kill the other hostages. So the decision was made for the hostage rescue team to enter the facility to try to rescue him. So as negotiators, we fed them a big meal for the first time in 8 days. We got them all happy and got their stomachs full and had them go to sleep. And then HRT went in and was very successful. No shots fired, all the hostages rescued, and the inmates rearrested. Well, that created, I believe, a high level of support for the HRT commander. In law enforcement, we always say we use force not because we can, but because we're left with no recourse. If I'm the head of the FBI and I got to stand in front of the news media or in a court of law, I have to have compelling reasons as to why we used force. I can't just say, well, we got tired or it was lasting too long. We had the capability, so we went and got him. I have to be able to articulate that our failure to act was likely going to lead to serious injury or loss of life. So that's really the only standard that's acceptable. And that's defensible for the Talladega prison. But the head of HRT's stock was so high there that even after messing up Ruby Ridge, they still had him on the job for Waco. And he's not a bad guy. He's well intended. He's trying to do the right thing, but he's got this sort of bullheaded, might is right, force is the answer to everything kind of approach. And that just doesn't work in these kinds of situations very often. I'm not suggesting there's not a time and place to use tactic. My son was a Navy. I'm not an anti-tactical guy, but but it's the last resort. We only do that when we have to. Um, so I don't know. That's a little far afield, but
Why do you think that in this particular situation in Waco, a lot of people comprehend it as like this metaphoric black and white situation, when in reality, Gary, as you know better than anybody, that's very complex. How is it that it's being viewed in my opinion, oftentimes by people very superficially, when the situation is a lot more complex than than the common person might wrap their heads around.
I think you're absolutely right, Brian, and I think that's a key, area of inquiry because there is a tendency, and we certainly see it in our political discourse today. You're on my side or the other side. It's right or it's wrong. Well, life isn't black and white. It's gray, and it's full of nuance. And a lot of people ask me for a very precise strategy on something, and I always say, well, it depends. It depends on a number of circumstances. I don't have to have the. There's a book out by Jamie Holmes called Nonsense: The Power of Not Knowing, and I was one of the people interviewed in the book and a chapter on. And the premise of the book is that some of the most successful people in life at different walks of life are comfortable dealing in the unknown. They're okay with not having an absolute answer, and that's kind of how I approach these situations as well. Don't seek the easy solution. Try to understand and appreciate the other's perspective. It doesn't mean you agree with them or you're going to have them over for dinner, but even the most incorrigible criminal probably has some aspect of their personality that you would find easy to speak with or talk about. You're trying to create everything in the world is based on relationship. We're trying to create a relationship of trust. So well, here's an example. When people come out, they don't come out because of an agreement. They come out because they trust the negotiator. And that's as true and would be true in Waco as it would be anything else. Every time we resolved a situation in my career, we got in the habit of saying, what was it that we said that made you come out? Because we're trying to learn and, validate what we're doing. Surprisingly, the answer was almost always the same. And it blows you away. It says, I don't remember what you said, but I like the way you said it.
Wow.
See, that's powerful, isn't it? I mean, when you think about that, and studies have shown that, a very high percentage of dialogue between humans, your impressions are based on how something is said more than what is said. Nobody remembers the individual words,
Yeah.
but if you come across as genuine, sincere, humble, likable, you probably going to be successful, whether you're in sales and, management or, in law enforcement, or, or broadcast, that's people want to work with people they like and respect. Boom. Secret sauce is now exposed, you know,
When I was in fourth grade, my teacher said, "It's not what you say, it's how you say it." And you
that's it.
exactly defined what she was getting at. And it's interesting because sometimes when getting in quarrels, whether it's just something, that you're speaking about something and somebody disagrees with you, and then you recount to somebody else what was going on, that person, when doing so, will change their tone of voice for you to go on their side to say, I only said do this and do that. But the thing is, when you said do this and do that, you didn't say it in that tone to that person initially. So,
You know, I saw it at home. I have two daughters and a son, and my middle daughter and my wife would often butt heads when my daughter was a teenager. They couldn't be closer now. But I would listen to these off the rail discussions, and I would say to my wife later on, I listened to what you said. I agree 100% with every single thing you did, and you said it really wrong. You know, and it and because it would just inflame my daughter or create a reaction that was not sought, and a lot of that had to do with tone and demeanor, and we underestimate that. In law enforcement, you go to any police department in the country, and there's a certain number of hours they train in firearms and making arrests and all important things, all critical things, but very little on communication. And that's probably the thing. The average police officer, certainly an FBI agent, that's your bread and butter. That's what you're doing all day long. Your job is to get information, get cooperation. And you have to earn the right for that. You have to invest the time and energy into coming across as a decent person, a sincere person. You're not there to make this person his day worse. You're respectful. And even this wino that you pick up in the streets, say if his name's Johnson, you say Mr. Johnson, um, everybody wants to be respected, and it's a nothing concession. What does it cost us? It costs us nothing to be decent people and treat. Now, there's people, no matter how well you treat them, they're going to, act out and create problems for you. But generally speaking, in human engagement and interaction, we will reap what we sow, and if we treat people in a certain way, later on they'll say, hey, Bryan, how'd you like talking to Gary? Well, he was a nice guy. I enjoyed it. He seemed casual and friendly and open to what I had to say, and said my questions were good or whatever. That's likability. And I would in turn, using our metaphor, I would say, I really enjoyed talking to Bryan. He had a really keen interest in this thing and asked some really good questions, and I enjoyed the conversation. That's life. Be that likable person.
Totally, totally agree with you, and I totally agree with the the conversation that we're having. I'm super enjoying this and coming at it from a very, like we said at the very beginning, respectful and professional. There's so many things like in history that repeats itself, but there hasn't been a Waco repeating itself. And so I'm wondering what, and you said it, you were only there for half of the standoff siege, but what role the FBI has had in improving things since Waco
Yeah.
to help diffuse. Because I think what, and you obviously know so much better than I, we haven't, what makes Waco Waco is that it's incomparable, in my humble opinion.
Hmm.
It hasn't happened since, in the United States at least. But what role could the FBI in saying, okay, we've learned and maybe that's why this hasn't happened again or to the extremes that has had.
Well, as I mentioned, the FBI, Department of Justice, FBI, um, Longworth, not Longworth, Danforth Commission. Um, there was a lot of examination. I testified before the House and the Senate on Waco. There was a clear realization within the organization that we had departed from our principles and our procedures. So I and one other crisis management expert in the FBI were sent to train every leader in the FBI after Waco. This is where we went wrong. This is what we should have done. Everyone, including special agent charge and assistant special agent charge. So we spent a good year doing that. And then, 2 years after Waco, we had 3 years after Waco, we had the Montana Freeman siege. You talk about we haven't had any more. Yeah, we did. That was an 85-day siege. And in this time, some dangerous elements hold up on some farmland. And now we have Louis Freeh as the director, who was more engaging than Sessions had been during Waco. And I'm out there, and Louis, in one of the conference calls with the bosses, he says, Director Freeh says, "Gary, are you there?" Yes, sir, I'm here. And he says, "I'm in no rush for this to end. I want this to end the right way." And you could see there was a sea change, and a realization from the very top on down that we need to do this as we know how to do it. So my negotiation team set the strategy. Yes, it took 85 days, but no reputational damage, no financial damage, on and on and on. And of course, it falls off. Nobody knows about it because there was no fiery ending at the end. The next year, I flew to Texas to help the Texas Rangers and the Department of Public Safety to manage another week-long siege with anti-government people. And again, following the same approach that I think I had influence with them because I said, don't do what we did at Waco. Don't make the same mistakes. And they listened and they followed the advice and it ended well. So, we have learned and I think it's a sad outcome for Waco, but again, I generally tell people, I said, listen, because some of the critics say the FBI just didn't know what they were dealing with. No, the FBI knew what we were dealing with. What we did was departed from the way we knew to successfully handle these. That's my firm opinion. Again, I told you others may disagree with it in the organization because I think it's hard for them to embrace the fact that our mistakes led to tragic outcome.
Yeah.
But they did
And you,
and contributed.
yeah, it contributed, and you hate that it would come at the expense of all of that loss of life and the tragedy.
Yeah.
But the reason there hasn't been news of another Waco is because, as you said, as horrifying and as horrible the outcome of Waco was, it did help in the future the FBI sort of look at themselves and avoid the escalation that of a mass, as in the number of people inside a building, to where nothing like that in Waco has happened in the United States since, with as tragic of an outcome. And
Right.
I don't know if that gets talked about, Gary. And we have to think about the humans and the loss of life first, foremost. But there was something that was learned from this, and I think you said it
Yeah,
very
the
well.
FBI created the Critical Incident Response Group to better coordinate. We train managers. The problem is like a lot of outfits. When you get to a certain level in the FBI, there's an assumption that you know how to do everything. When you're a equivalent of a general in the FBI. Well, you may be very good at routine things your office does, investigating fraud or healthcare fraud or organized crime, whatever it is that your office in Houston or Milwaukee or Seattle are doing. That's all well and good. But how often does an individual field general work something like this? And in the past, it used to be, well, it's your territory, you're in charge. But we didn't really provide them with training and guidance at a management level. So now they created the critical incident response group. So now when there's a major event, that element for the FBI goes out. And while the local general may still be in charge and according to the public, the real decision maker is this person that trains and does this full time. And it's made a world of difference. And so they're less likely to make emotional, arbitrary decisions that we know better than doing.
Last question for you. Gary Nestor is with me. I'm Bryan Fenley. 32 years later, it is so discussed amongst anybody. And it's hard to have a historical event that's 32 years old that has been this talked about to this age or to this stage. And how do you feel like the lessons learned from Waco, beyond what the FBI has learned through this process, have impacted society and culture to this day, and what people can take from it, even from those 1993 experiences?
Well, we know that 2 years after Waco, Timothy McVeigh, who had come out to visit
Yeah.
during the siege, had perpetrated the Oklahoma City bombing. I mean, that's a direct result of his perceptions about, you know, government wrongdoing at Waco. And to a large extent, it has fueled other right-wing anti-government movements that persist today. Some of these nuts that went to the Capitol on January 6th, Boogaloo Boys and all these others. Um, these are kind of patriot wannabes that somehow have embraced this sense that the government's this big, terrible conspiracy. It's just kind of naive and it's sort of silly. The FBI, like any other organization, it's a complex organization. It's got great people, a great mission. Is it infallible? Hell no. Does it make mistakes? Of course. But it's basically trying to serve the American people and trying to do good, as most law enforcement agencies do. So, but we have to constantly learn and evaluate how we do things. How can we make sure we minimize errors and mistakes and improve the product because we're public servants. We serve the public. We need to be seen by the public as, thank God they're here. They're going to get this problem solved. And I mean, I've seen that when I've worked kidnappings, and parents will tell you, "Well, thank God you guys were here to save my child." I mean, but if you expand that out to a larger kind of siege situation, we want that same reaction from the public. We want the public to see us as someone to cooperate with and someone who will stick by them and make sure justice is served for whatever challenge they're facing. But yeah, I think I'm really troubled by so much of what I see today in our political discourse of this. I even see it, the FBI's, it's all corrupted and it's terrible. And I just, on my 30 years in the FBI, I never know what political party anybody was in. It's a very conservative organization, so I would assume that when I was in, 90% were probably Republican, but nobody asked, nobody cares. Nobody says, I'm going to assign you to work this case. What party do you belong to? It's just not an issue. And then I see agents being fired or, just because they worked on the January 6th case. It really troubles me because it's turning the outfit into a partisan entity. We nobody ever asked me, Gary, would you like to work this investigation? I mean, you get assigned to do something, and so oh, I don't want to work that. It might be controversial. And I don't think you should punish people for doing what they've been assigned to do. And anyway, I got a little editorialized there, Brian, so I
Yeah.
apologize.
That's okay. But a lot of the stories that you share and a lot of the experiences that you've had are well articulated in your book, and I encourage people to give that a look. Stalling for Time: My Life as an FBI Negotiator, My Life as an FBI Hostage Negotiator, and
Yeah,
Amazon.com
I
is
try to, I obviously profile my career and the rise of negotiation in law enforcement, and I embed a lot of lessons within the stories that I talk about. So yeah, I hope people will find it helpful and useful, and it's gotten good reviews and sold a lot. So that's all well and good, you
well,
know.
I feel like this conversation was all well and good, and the information and the insights from you that allowed us just a grander perspective from the Waco situation and just your experiences in general. Gary Noesner, retired chief of the FBI's crisis unit. I'm Bryan Fenley. This is the Historically Present podcast. Gary, thanks so much for being in my presence today. I really appreciate you.
My pleasure.